Okay, hello and welcome to the November Crane Research Forum. We're so glad that you're here, both in person and online today. I'm Rebecca Dorr, Director of Research here at the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy. A quick couple of notes before we dive in. First, we'll have question and answer towards the end, and we want to hear from both our in-person and our online audience. So please do use the Q&A feature online to submit those questions, and if you're in the room, you can just raise your hand. We'll also ask you to fill out a very short survey before we dismiss at the end of the day today. It'll only take a minute or so, but it is incredibly valuable for us, and we are actually aiming for 100% participation. So because your feedback really helps make sure these events are meaningful and valuable for our audience. So a link and a QR code will be shared on the screen to make it really easy to fill that out very briefly at the end of the talk today. Now on to today's forum. I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Virginia Tompkins. Dr. Tompkins is a professor of developmental psychology at The Ohio State University, Lima, and a faculty affiliate here at Crane. Her research explores how young children develop social understanding through language, narratives, and interaction with caregivers. Her work examines theory of mind and how early experiences shape children's ability to understand others and engage meaningfully in shared learning context. Today, Dr. Tompkins will share about her research and insights learned across these integrated areas of study. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Tompkins.
All right, thank you so much for having me. So today I'll be talking about complementary relations among young children's shared reading experiences, social understanding, and narrative comprehension. It's quite a mouthful. So here's an outline for today. I'll talk about theory of mind. So that's the particular type of social understanding I'm most interested in. I'll talk about how that's shaped by parent-child interactions, especially shared reading. I'll talk about how theory of mind is related to the home literacy environment, as well as narrative comprehension, and then take a look at how we might integrate all of these different areas of research. So theory of mind is a broad concept that refers to our own and other people's mental states and understanding how those mental states motivate behavior. It's something that develops throughout the lifespan, starting in infancy and actually through the adult lifespan as well. Just to hit a few milestones in early childhood, by the end of the first year, children are understanding that people's desires guide their actions. They understand things like, if I have a favorite object, they would be surprised if I reached for a different object. At 2 years of age, toddlers are understanding that desires may differ from another person's desire. If I prefer broccoli and the child prefers carrots, they would be surprised if I picked carrots over broccoli. They're also able to label basic emotions like happy, sad, mad. At 3 years of age, they're able to understand the relation between beliefs and actions. For example, if Jimmy thinks his toy truck is in the toy chest, that's where he will look for the toy truck. And then at 4 to 5, a critical milestone occurs where children understand that people's beliefs can be false. It's also called false belief understanding. This is when children understand that they can have a belief that differs from someone else or a belief that's different from reality. This is where social understanding really becomes representational because they can hold in mind a belief that is different from someone else or different from what's happening in the real world. So a lot of researchers think that this false belief understanding is a critical milestone of theory of mind. Sometimes it's even used interchangeably with that term theory of mind. At 5 to 6 years, they understand that people can feel one emotion but display another, like when they get a disappointing gift. So there's a lot that's developing in the early childhood years. Again, this false belief understanding is a critical milestone. So I'm going to touch on that one a little bit more with a task that researchers use to measure false belief understanding. This is the Sally Ann task or a change of locations task. There's lots of different false belief tasks, but this is a really popular one. So we have characters that are usually acted out with pictures or with props. The child is told a story. So this is Sally and this is Ann. Sally puts her ball in the basket, Sally goes away, and then Anne moves the ball to her box. So the test question is, where will Sally look for her ball? So younger children, like 3-year-olds, have a difficult time with this and will often say that the child or that the character will look for the ball in the box because that's where they know it to be. Older children, older preschoolers often get this right. They say that Sally will look for her ball in the basket because they know that that's where Sally left it. So that's the representation that's happening there. They understand at the older preschool age, that you can have a belief that is also false. Yep. So as I said, theory of mind develops across the lifespan. It doesn't just stop when children understand that false belief task. So in middle childhood and into adulthood, advanced theory of mind refers to more advanced concepts. We have to understand nuance in social interactions. We have to understand the context of what is happening in social engagements. Things like irony and sarcasm. So for example, if somebody compliments their aunt's hat by saying it's beautiful when in fact they think it is ugly, why would they do that? So we have conventions like white lies that we tell people. That would be part of theory of mind understanding. And the Sally Ann task is considered a first order false belief task because it involves just one person's beliefs, Sally's belief. But we can have second order, third order. So Sally thinks that John thinks that Mary thinks. And that's often something we encounter in narratives where we have to track all of the different perspectives that are happening in a narrative. So these are things that continue developing, but most of my research is on the earlier childhood years. So why does it matter? Why should we care that kids can or cannot do these things? So one reason is because it is related to their social skills. Children who have better theory of mind skills have better pro-social skills. So this was a meta-analysis that looked across all of the studies published on theory of mind and pro-social skills and found a pretty consistent link with theory of mind and things like sharing, cooperating, helping. It's also important because it's related to academic skills, and something I'll talk about at the end of the talk is text comprehension. So theory of mind is very much related to comprehending a text. When you're reading a story, you have to interpret the character's mental states and why they're doing something or why they're saying something. So theory of mind plays a role in that as well. And please feel free, those of you who are here in person, to stop me if you have any questions along the way, any clarifications that are needed. So one of my earliest areas of research was on theory of mind and how it might be promoted through parent-child interactions. So a lot of the research on parent-child interactions and theory of mind comes from this social constructivist account of theory of mind that argues that children develop these skills through natural conversation with more experienced partners. It could be peers or teachers. My research usually focuses on parents. That through engagement in conversation, storytelling, for example, children come to understand the contents of the mind and understand differing perspectives. And people from this theoretical background might focus on different aspects of this language. We can focus on the lexical component, meaning the words of the mind. So they argue that children learn the words of the mind, like think and know, feel, sad, all of those vocabulary words. And that then helps them map their experiences in the world onto those terms that we use to talk about the mind. There's also syntactic perspectives that argue that the syntax of how we talk about the mind, especially the word think, gives children the representation needed. So if we say something like Sally thinks the ball is in the box, they are given sort of the structure to understand that someone can think something that actually isn't true, that there's that contrast between those two. And then a pragmatic perspective might focus more on just the navigation of perspectives that comes when you're having a conversation, that we might not even necessarily need mental state vocabulary to understand that somebody has a different perspective from us. And this theoretical view borrows from some other similar concepts, theories, like the zone of proximal development. That's a Vygotsky idea that there's this distance between what children can do alone and what they can do with a partner. And the scaffolding is the mechanism that brings them up to that higher level of understanding. The scaffolding is the support, the help that the parent would give them to understand, for example, that a character is thinking something different than another character. So I would say that this is a heavily scaffolded conversation. This is from a book, Ms. Fox's Class Gets It Wrong, that I've used in my own research. And the book is about Miss Fox, and she's dating Officer Blue Fox, but her class thinks that she's in trouble with the law because they're seeing her like at the jail and they're seeing her talk to the police officer. And there's a lot of misunderstanding going on in the story. But at the end, you come to realize as the reader that she was just dating Officer Blue Fox, and they got married and the class went to the wedding and it was all good. But still, children get to the end of the book and some of them are like, but why did she go to jail? So they've completely missed the point. So it really highlights the false belief understanding part, that they're kind of stuck on the beginning of the story where everyone thought that she was going to jail or she was in trouble with the law. They have a difficult time reconciling that, no, that's not really what was happening. But this parent did a really good job of going into a lot of detail, recapping the story, saying, no, they thought she was going to jail because she was talking to Mr. Blue Fox, but she was just going to visit him. So the parent is reconciling for the child what the conflict in the perspectives is there in a very elaborative and scaffolded way. So we definitely see that there's variability in how parents talk about mental states. So here's another example. This is from a book called The Black Rabbit, where Rabbit, that's the character's name, is afraid of his shadow, which they call the Black Rabbit. And so this is a task where we actually just give parents one page opening and ask what would they do or what would they say to the child. And one parent might say, why do you think Rabbit is so scared? Do you know what the Black Rabbit is? So using that mental state vocabulary, highlighting the different perspectives. Another one might just focus on perceptual features. Look how big the rabbit is. And other parents just say nothing. They wouldn't add anything at all to the story. So several studies now show that parents' mental state talk to children is related to their theory of mind understanding. So I completed a meta-analysis around the same time as another research team, and we came to the same conclusion that there's a somewhat modest but a significant relation between how much mental state vocabulary parents use when they're talking to children and children's theory of mind. And usually those mental states are coded in this way. So cognitive terms, emotion terms, desire terms are really popular ways of coding for this type of talk. Other categories include perception, physiology, modulations of assertion like might or maybe. But those first three are like the core terms that we're looking for. Sometimes they use a total, sometimes they break those down. So in our meta-analysis, we also did look at sort of more qualitative aspects of this coding by looking at whether it was just mentioning a mental state or explaining it, and found that the link with theory of mind was stronger with the more explanatory talk, like the Black Rabbit example before. And also when the talk was focused on cognition. So especially for preschoolers, the cognitive talk, think, know, believe, remember, is the type of talk that seems to best facilitate children's theory of mind. A lot of this work is correlational. It is incredibly time consuming to measure parent-child book reading, to transcribe it, to code it. So a lot of the work is cross-sectional. We measure parents' mental state talk and children's theory of mind at the same point in time. But there are some longitudinal studies, and those studies do suggest causality. So longitudinal work is important because it could just be that it's not really the parents' talk that's promoting theory of mind, but maybe kids that have better theory of mind just have parents who talk to them more about mental states. They see that, that they're precocious in that area and they talk more about those things. So just to use one of my own studies as an example, we addressed that causality by measuring children's theory of mind twice, 6 months apart, and we controlled for that initial theory of mind and found that parents' mental state talk still predicted children's false belief understanding 6 months later, controlling for other relevant factors like the child's vocabulary. And we did that with this book, Mr. Peek and the Misunderstanding at the Zoo, another book filled with misunderstandings. So this was about a zookeeper who put on his son's jacket by mistake at the start of the day. And so he walks around the zoo saying awful things about himself, like, oh, you're getting so fat. And so there's lots of misunderstandings, like the hippo thinks that Mr. Peek is calling her fat. So lots of chances for the parents to stop and say, this is what's happening in the story, and explaining that the characters are having this misunderstanding. So this would be an example of what we called contrastive language. The hippo thinks that Mr. Peek said that she's getting fat, but he's really talking about himself. That was the kind of language that predicted children's false belief understanding 6 months later, more so than just total mental state vocabulary, more so than just using that complement syntax construction. that a character thinks that. It was the contrastive language specifically, that explanatory talk, which again is similar to like the example of the Miss Fox, where the parent really stopped and explained what was happening. Another clue about why cognitive talk might be so important is that parents do tend to use different constructions with different mental state language. And so in this study, we actually used a wordless book. So in a wordless book, it kind of leaves open for the parent to decide how they're going to narrate the story. It kind of lets us see more about what they would choose to say to the child. And we found that parents' cognition talk was very likely to be in an open-ended question format and unlikely to be in other formats like yes, no questions or statements. And from the social constructivist viewpoint, they would argue that part of the mechanism for why that promotes theory of mind is that it gets children talking about the mind. It actually engages them in conversation. So the fact that in this study, at least, the mother's cognitive language most often happened in the open-ended question format suggests that maybe that's one reason why it matters so much. It's the language that gets children engaged in the conversation, which is what this next one shows. So same study, but this contingency is looking at the mother's open-ended questions and whether or not the child responded or not. The black bar is that they responded with an internal state word. The white is that the child responded in a connected way, like they responded in a way that was contingent, even if it didn't necessarily have that mental state vocabulary. So these are contingencies. It's showing the likelihood that if this occurs, what's the what's the result? And so it shows that when moms ask those open-ended questions, children are very likely to provide a mental state. They're unlikely to do that if the mom is making a comment or asking a closed question, like a yes/no question. So this is just suggesting that, again, getting children talking about mental states might be important for their theory of mind development. And that's just an example up here. What do you think he wants to do? And the child responds, play outside. Lots of what do you think, or what do you think he's doing? Lots of those sorts of questions in this book. So a lot of this work is correlational, which of course cannot tell us directly about causality. However, there are many training studies that suggest that this mental state talk promotes children's theory of mind. There's a recent review paper that discusses the narrative intervention specifically. A lot of these are not with parents, though. So many of these training studies are with researchers as the more advanced partner, and I'll highlight one of my own studies. So in this study, we had a training, a theory of mind training with preschoolers, where the researcher came into the preschool and read 15 books total that focused on theory of mind themes. So there's lots of theory of mind themes in children's books: deception and trickery and misunderstandings, false beliefs. So we did this 3 times for 5 weeks, so for a total of 15 books. There were 2 control groups. So one control group was read the same books, but without the active engagement and discussion. So that's important for making sure that it really is not just the exposure to mental states, but getting children talking about the mental states that matters. And then another control group that didn't do anything during the 5 weeks. So from this study of my own and from the review, it seems like there's some active ingredients to these training studies. One is the mental state vocabulary that's introduced, lots of questions about what's the character thinking, or like the connection between seeing and knowing. If you don't see something, you don't know what happens, and also about characters' emotions. Other active ingredients are the conversation. So in this study of mine, we found that children did have improved false belief understanding, but only in the condition where they were both read the book and engaged in the conversation about the book, not when they were just read the book and nothing else, and not in the control group. So the mental state vocabulary, the engagement and discussion, and then a third one is the use of corrective feedback. So in many of these interventions, the child would be asked a question, and it kind of doesn't matter what they say. The point is that you give them the right information. So if they say the wrong thing, the experimenter just very kindly redirects them to the right answer, hoping that over time, after these many, many readings of books, they would kind of catch on to how mental states work in stories. So here's an example of one of the books that was used in my own training study. This is a book called Where's Jamela, where Jamela doesn't want to move, her family's moving, so she climbs into this box and falls asleep, and then the family's frantic because she's lost and they don't know where she is. So of course the reader knows, well, she's just asleep in the box. But again, like with the Miss Fox story, even if the reader knows that, children sometimes kind of miss the point. They have a hard time following all those perspectives. So the intervention question at this point, we would stop at various points in the story. The question was, did anyone see Jamela climb in the box? And we point to the box, make it very clear to the child what we're talking about. And if they say no, we'd say, no, that's right. Nobody saw Jamela climb in the box and nobody knows she's in there. And then it's actually a point we would come back to later in the book when that misunderstanding arises and the family thinks she's lost instead of just in the box. There are very few training studies implemented by parents, but there are a few with toddlers. So with toddlers, the focus is more on desire language. So when I gave that progression of theory of mind concepts, there's sort of a general progression where children learn about desires first, and then emotions, and then beliefs, sort of like the order of difficulty. So with younger children, the interventions are focused on understanding desires, and children did have improved theory of mind understanding with tasks that are appropriate for the younger kids, doing something quite similar where the parents are given books, they're told what to say in the books, and then we measure children's theory of mind understanding. There are also similar training studies implemented by teachers, usually with older kids, like the K-5 age range, with a similar approach where teachers read a book, they ask the right kind of questions, and children have improved theory of mind. I do have pilot work with parents of preschoolers to see if it would be feasible to get parents to do this. So similar to the training study I did with the 15 books, but with parents, we gave them 4 books. They read each book 3 times a week, and then in the 5th week, they read all 4 books. And we found that they could do this. They actually had a pretty good success rate. And it was pilot, so it's a very small sample size, but the children did have a very large improvement in theory of mind in that condition relative to a control condition who actually dropped a little bit in their theory of mind understanding. There's also similar work with children with autism, also small sample sizes, but showing that this approach helps to improve theory of mind. So I think we have pretty good causal evidence that this kind of supportive, scaffolded language where we're explaining mental states is facilitating children's theory of mind. So I've been talking a lot about books. I love children's books. I've got lots of children's books in my house, even though my kids are like in middle school now. I don't let those books leave the house though. So I think there's something special about books. Of course, parents could talk about mental states at the dinner table or while they're playing with their kids or while they're reminiscing, but I think there's something in particular about the book that really helps to promote theory of mind skills. In our meta-analysis, going back to that, we did find that the book context was one of the stronger relations with theory of mind and significantly stronger than a reminiscing context. So what is it about books? So for one thing, children's books are rich in mental state language and theory of mind concepts. So there are some studies that have just looked at the book itself and coded for like how many times do they use these different words or what are the themes that are coming up. And we find that especially narrative books, high quality narrative books are rich in these concepts. I've already mentioned some examples like the deception, the trickery, misunderstandings when there's false beliefs. Those are pretty common. Also, I think the illustrations matter. So the illustrations make some of these invisible mental concepts more visible, more easy, easier for children to understand what's happening because they're seeing the language of the book, but they're also seeing the pictures that goes along with that. And so it can support them in their understanding, like trying to think about the rabbit being afraid of the black rabbit as the rabbit shadow is something that's helped with the illustrations. And in this book, The Black Rabbit, the word shadow actually never appears. So it would be really important for the child to see the shadow and hear that language from the parent about the shadow and that conflict and perspective. And then characters also offer the opportunity to discuss different perspectives. So I think there's an important component of the book as being part of this triadic interaction where you've got the parent, you've got the child, and you've got the book. And the parent and the child are kind of coordinating their perspectives, but also with the characters in the book too, to be able to talk about, what do you think? And this is what I think, and this is what the character thinks. So engaging all of those different perspectives is important. I'm moving on to another topic. Any quick questions before I move on? Okay, so the book, as I've said, I think is really important for children's theory of mind development. Less research has focused on exposure to books themselves. A lot of it is about the parents talking about mental states while reading a book. But there's also some research on preschoolers' theory of mind and the home literacy environment. And so the home literacy environment is referring to not what parents are doing per se, but the just general environment of literacy in the home. So the number of books children have available to them, how often parents read with their child. So not really the quality of the reading, but just how frequently do they do this? Do they go to the library often? What was the onset of shared reading? So we know that like not eating, I'm seeing you eating. Reading early in infancy even is important for developing literacy skills and that motivation to read. So all of these factors are actually related to children's theory of mind. And one sort of framework or theoretical perspective for why that would be is the social processes and content and trained by narrative framework from Raymond Marr that says that when we're exposed to reading literature, we are getting practice in social processes. So that's like the actual skills you're learning by reading about other people. You're learning things like how do you make mental state inferences, or how do you engage in visual spatial perspective taking. And you're also being exposed to the content of the mind. So not just the mental state vocabulary, but like just understanding how human psychology works. Like what is it that makes people mad? Or what is it that happens when someone tries to deceive another person? In my own work, we found that the relation was stronger for younger preschoolers, and that kind of makes sense because as kids get older, they're being exposed to lots of other outside influences, the classroom and teachers, they're reading on their own. So that home literacy environment seems especially important for younger preschoolers' theory of mind. There's very little longitudinal work. So compared to the mental state talk research, this one is much less studied. There is one longitudinal study though. So she found that the home literacy environment, like how often parents read and how many books they have at home, at 3.5 was related to children's theory of mind at 5. They did not control for earlier theory of mind though. And I have to mash that just right to get it to advance. And then another study that I have, an unpublished study, we actually compiled a list of theory of mind books, meaning books that really focus in on all of those concepts that I've mentioned, and many of them recognizable books that many parents would have potentially been exposed to. And the more those books that parents said they had read to their children, the better children's theory of mind was. So it wasn't just about like the frequency of reading books or how many books they have, but the parents that were reading those kinds of books, the ones rich in theory of mind concepts, were the ones that had better, children with better theory of mind. And there's not much research at all that looks at whether this is just the same construct as parents' mental state talk, but the few studies that have find that they're not really highly related. So it seems to be a different source of mental state information. It's not that the parents who are engaging in a lot of mental state talk are necessarily the ones that read the most to their kids or have the most books in their home. These seem to be somewhat separate constructs. All right, so It would make sense then that theory of mind skills are related to narrative comprehension, given what I've said about how important it is to understand the mental states of the characters, to understand the overall story, to not kind of miss the message of the book. So much of this research argues that theory of mind predicts narrative comprehension. Listening comprehension would refer to oral stories. So usually used with younger kids where you read a story to them, they answer questions. Reading comprehension, often with older kids or adults, where they would read the passage themselves and then answer the question. So a popular model of how theory of mind relates to listening or reading comprehension is the direct and indirect effects model of reading from Kim. So she bases this model on the situation model of reading, which says that reading involves these hierarchically related skills. At the surface level, the surface code, you're understanding just the literal words on the page and decoding those, understanding what's being said. The text-based level is interpreting the individual units of meaning in the text, but then to understand the reading as a whole, to develop this situation model of what you're reading, there's a lot of other processes going on. Theory of mind is important, trying to understand the mental state inferences that need to be drawn, integrating the text with what is already known about the world, causal and temporal relations. And in her models, she shows that theory of mind is both directly related to listening comprehension and reading comprehension, but it's also a mediator of those lower level skills like vocabulary or executive functioning and listening comprehension. So theory of mind is needed to build that situation model and understand the overall meaning of the text. And her work shows that theory of mind is related to text comprehension, listening or reading, in children from kindergarten to fourth grade. So in that model, however, theory of mind is just sort of one component. It doesn't stand out as like central necessarily. It's a reading comprehension model. Others choose to focus a little more exclusively on the relation between theory of mind and narrative. So Bruner's concept of dual landscapes is sometimes drawn on. So the landscape of action is referring to what's literally happening in the story, what the characters are doing. So in the Black Rabbit example, the landscape of action might be something like, Rabbit said, "Go away, Black Rabbit." The landscape of consciousness, though, involves a theory of mind concept. So why is he saying that though? Or why is he doing that? Why is he scared? So all of those unspoken things in the narrative that have to be deciphered in order to understand the overall story. So we have a recent meta-analysis on this topic as well with Rebecca Dorr that showed that theory of mind is related to listening and reading comprehension across the lifespan. So this was a meta-analysis with about 45 studies, I think over 5,000 participants. And the participants ranged in age from 3 to 70. And so we could look and see whether there were differences across the lifespan. And we found that at every age, theory of mind and text comprehension were significantly related, and there was no significant difference in these effect sizes. Even though the values are different, there's no statistically significant difference here. So theory of mind remains important even into the adult years. It also doesn't depend even on the task. So one criticism sometimes of this research on theory of mind and narrative comprehension is like, well, isn't the theory of mind task just a narrative task? Like they would be related because they're both sort of stories where you're asking questions. But that doesn't seem to be the case either, because all of these tasks were significantly related to theory of mind. And there was no significant difference in the magnitude of those relations. Some of these are tasks that don't require narrative at all. The reading the mind and the eyes task, for example, is something given to adults often. So no storytelling whatsoever. This is a task where you look at the different sets of eyes. You're given 4 words and you have to choose the word that best describes the expression on the face. And that is significantly related to theory of mind. Some of these other tasks are more narrative-based, some are less. And so that kind of supports the idea that theory of mind understanding is more fundamentally related to narrative comprehension than just some shared similarity in the tasks that are given. Here is an example of theory of mind and reading comprehension in adults in a study that we recently finished under review. So we did use this reading the mind and the eyes task with adults, with college students, and found that it was significantly related to reading comprehension. And those effect sizes are controlling for vocabulary, executive functioning skills, social class, all sorts of things. We also found that the author recognition test was related to adults' theory of mind understanding. So this is a test where we give adults a list of authors and they have to select the real authors versus they have to select the real authors and ignore the ones that aren't real. It's an indirect measure of how much adults are reading, because presumably people who read more would be familiar with the authors' names and those who don't wouldn't. So we found that that was related to theory of mind as well, and that theory of mind mediated that relation. In other words, the adults who read more have better theory of mind understanding and in turn have better reading comprehension. Here's another example. This was one in, jumping ahead. This relation has to do with whether the studies were cross-sectional or longitudinal. So something else that was uncovered with that meta-analysis is that this relation appears to be mutually reinforcing, because it didn't actually matter if the data were collected cross-sectionally or longitudinally. The effect sizes were very similar. And we also looked at the direction of that effect. So some studies would measure comprehension first and then theory of mind later, or the reverse. And both were significant. There was no significant difference between those two relations either. And so what you see at the bottom is just kind of a hypothetical. Like, these are probably mutually reinforcing skills that develop over time, that develop simultaneously, that support one another. I've talked a lot about how theory of mind would support text comprehension, but there's probably some things about text comprehension that support theory of mind as well. Things like schema activation, like when you're reading a story, you start to develop ideas about how things typically go, like what usually happens in a story of deception. What's the kind of, typical order of events that would come in that sort of story? That's something that likely supports theory of mind as well. And there was one study I highlighted on the prior slide, the Lecce study. This was with middle childhood. They looked at theory of mind and text comprehension 6 months apart and found that they were significantly related in both directions. So that also supports that view. This one was with preschoolers, one of my own studies that looked at false belief understanding and narrative comprehension. And then again, 6 months later, similar to the Lecce study, we found that they were mutually reinforcing, that the direction, both of those directions was significant. This one was limited by a somewhat small sample size of only about 50 participants. So when we controlled for language, that relation, all of these relations actually disappeared, unfortunately. However, that is, again, one of the nice things about a meta-analysis. So because we were pulling the results from these 45 studies, we have more statistical power to look at things like, does it hold when we control for language? And so in the meta-analysis, we had several studies that controlled for language or executive functioning skills or both, and found that the relation does remain when we control for those. So it does reduce more so by controlling language than it does executive functioning skills, but the effect still remains. And actually our overall effect was, I think it was a 0.33 was the effect size, which is actually pretty robust for a theory of mind meta-analysis. So a lot of evidence that theory of mind and narrative comprehension most definitely are related, and related in a fundamental way. This is just an example of an executive functioning task, the dimensional change card sort task, where kids have to learn one rule to sort by color and another to sort by shape, but then it gets confusing when you keep switching up the rules and they have to keep straight which one they're doing. So a lot of people argue that executive functioning skills are important to account for, because those are involved in both theory of mind understanding and in narrative comprehension. right, so the final point is just that there is a lot of evidence about the relationship between the home literacy environment and theory of mind, between parents' mental state talk and theory of mind, between theory of mind and narrative comprehension, but it's not really been integrated just yet. So we currently have a study funded by the National Science Foundation, Developmental Sciences, that we call Predictors of Reading in Social Minds, or PRISM, that does just that. So we have several goals in this project. So our first research goal is to look at the home literacy environment and how that predicts both children's theory of mind and children's narrative comprehension. So if we're arguing that these are complementary skills, theory of mind and narrative comprehension, it would make sense that they originate from the same social experiences. And then our second research goal is looking at parents' mental state talk and those skills. And then the third goal is just looking at the interplay between theory of mind and narrative comprehension over time. So the design here is that we test all of these things in wave 1, and then 6 months later, test theory of mind and narrative comprehension. And 6 months later after that, test those skills again. It's autoregressive, so we're controlling for the initial theory of mind and narrative comprehension to ensure that it's not just that parents talk more about mental states, for example, with kids that have better theory of mind skills. And we also argue here that some of these pathways are really well understood, like the pathway between the parents' mental state talk and children's theory of mind is really well established. But then others, we don't really know as much about. Like, would parents' mental state talk predict children's narrative comprehension? Maybe. There's not much research on that. And one of the practical implications here is for the design of interventions. So I mentioned that there's lots of interventions that do successfully train children's theory of mind understanding, but there's dispute from researchers about whether they think that training theory of mind should also result in improvements to narrative comprehension. And this kind of just lays the framework for how these different early predictors are related to narrative comprehension and theory of mind to help us understand what targets of intervention we should be exploring. I do want to mention that there's a book forthcoming. If anyone's interested in more about narrative and theory of mind, there are 2 chapters in this book, Language and Theory of Mind, with my collaborator, Derek Montgomery, that's coming out in March of 2026. That is written in a way that I think is accessible for people that don't know a whole lot about theory of mind necessarily. I also want to mention, especially on the PRISM project, the wonderful people that helped make that happen, the staff involved and the undergraduate students, which some of them are actually here. Thank you so much for coming. I want to mention that I'm on a regional campus, so I do not supervise graduate students. That's why most of my work is first authored. So I very much rely on undergraduate students to help all of this work take place, and I really appreciate their efforts. I think Rebecca will come up and help us with questions.
Start taking questions from the room. Questions from online as well? We can get started with online questions to get us going. One question I thought was interesting was about the practical implications, and specifically whether you had considered bilingual or multilingual parents in any of your studies or any of the others, and what that looks like, what theory of mind might look like in these relations for children who are speaking more than one language at home.
Oh, goodness. So yes, that's a wonderful question, but unfortunately, the geographic region that my campus is in, the Lima area, is like 99.5% English speaking. So I would love to explore that question, but I don't have the resources really to do that in the area that I'm in. But I know that there is research on bilingualism and conversation. Honestly, I'm not super up to speed on that.
Questions from the room? Some specific practice-based questions from online. one very specific one was whether the list of children's books that highlight theory of mind that you mentioned is publicly available somewhere that some people can access.
Yes, it is. So I do have that resource on Open Science Framework. It was 80 books. I have kind of like informally added to the list, but it is there, like those 80 books are there now, so I can share the link with you.
We'll reference that and send that out with our
Yeah.
The recording for fit. Thank you. The other practice question was about
Sorry, Rebecca, the captioner is asking.
get closer, sorry. The other question, practice-based question, was about whether reading a book or any book aloud, or they suggest that reading a book aloud is more effective when the caregiver and child do to sort of practice serve and return interactions, and have a book with good content. And they ask for those of us who have the opportunity to sort of coach parents about read aloud time, do you have additional tips for them to offer, or even better, like a model for parents or caregivers to provide?
So like a resource that's readily available.
Sure, yeah, sort of a model or a resource that you could provide for these folks who are in these organizations. A specific question, I think, comes from someone from Reach Out and Read, but also sort of just any general tips you have for how to better support those interactions to promote theory of mind and narrative comprehension, I think.
Yeah, sure. So I could also put something together. I don't have something readily available, but I'm sure I could source something easily to share. But I think that just the guidance to parents, to caregivers to engage in conversation is really important, to assess, monitor children's understanding, like we saw with the Ms. Fox book. Even parents might think, oh, of course my child understands the story, but unless you engage in conversation or ask questions, sometimes it's not always clear what children are misunderstanding.
Absolutely. Thanks. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just curious, was there intention around looking at whether the characters were people or animals, or if they matched the demographic of the families, the child, teacher?
I'm looking at my student here who's doing her senior thesis on whether characters are animals or human. But in the studies I've done thus far, I have not looked at that, but I, in my more recent work, have been very much interested in the match between the characteristics of the child and the characters in the book. So I do have, it's not on theory of mind per se, but I do have research showing that preschoolers actually did better when the characteristics mismatched their own. So when they were like an opposite gender or race, which was sort of surprising and different than other research, including Rebecca's research. But we also have looked at whether they were animals or humans, and actually, like, I've not published it yet, we're still collecting data, but we did find some preliminary evidence that children's theory of mind was actually more strongly related when they were listening to a human character's book than an animal character's book. So probably something about like seeing yourself in the characters like elicits that mind reading more so than animal characters. When we ask parents if they choose books based on things like whether it matches the child's gender or race, most of them say they don't think that that's important. So I don't have a direct answer except that, yes, I'm thinking about all of those things in the work that's going on now.
Could you just ask the caption? They're actually that captioning in the chat box instead of
To do captioning in the chat box?
they're in the chat box.
Oh, you're currently in the chat box, not in the captions. Is that right? Okay. Other questions from the room? One of the other questions that came in online was about whether there were differences in like the levels of theory of mind or some of the other constructs, and then the relationships between them based on whether children were in childcare or not during those preschool years.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, we have those data because we ask about all sorts of things when we survey parents, but I don't know of from my own research or other research specifically about childcare, not except to just say what I said before, that I think the early learning environment becomes more important as children get older, like in those early elementary years. And, you know, maybe teacher interventions are with that age group, but I don't know specifically about like daycare versus not.
Future research questions.
Yes.
Good. Yeah, I'll chime in with one of my questions, and then we'll see if we have other questions from the room or online. But one of the things that I know, that I've thought about, and I know you have thought about as well, is children's media. And I wonder if you talk about books being a really special case for parent-child interactions and conversations around these theory of mind concepts. And I wonder if you could speak to our audience about how you think media might play into that and what that might look like in a media context.
Yes. So you're the media expert, not me.
They won't know what you think.
But we have recently been exploring what children are watching, what their favorite shows are, and trying to code that in some way for whether it contains social, emotional themes. So we've just begun that work, and I think that it definitely probably has promise for being related to theory of mind. But again, similar to book reading, it's about the interaction. It's about what is shared. Not, it's the triad again, not just the child and the screen, but is there someone there facilitating their understanding, engaging them in conversation? We actually find in this recent work we're working on that the content, the social emotional content of the shows themselves actually are not related to theory of mind, but it's probably because we're missing that interactive component. We don't really know how they were viewing that content.
Is there any connection, like if a parent asks a mental state question about a character, and then followed it up with like a question or getting the child to reflect, have you felt that way before? Is there any connection with that?
I don't know in direct response to that question, but in a roundabout way, there is a lot of research looking at the referent of the mental state. So usually it's either the caregiver, the child, or the character. And not in that kind of like dynamic way that you're talking about, because that's really hard to code for. But just looking at those as categories, yes, as kids get older, especially the focus on the characters' thoughts and or mental states and the child's mental states are especially important. Whereas when they're younger, it's more important for the parents to focus on the child's mental states. And then the mother's mental states never matter. Like that's never really related to much of anything. So I think probably a combination of both of those things, because that's the like coordination and perspective that I think matters. Like, what do you think? And what does the character think? And how those might be different.
Kevin.
I noticed that there weren't a lot of studies looking at like training parents to do this kind of work, and I don't know if it's been looked at at all, but if there is a difference in the significance for like parents working on it versus a researcher working on it versus a teacher, like is it all equal for the child in terms of their outcomes when they're learning these theory of mind ideas?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say the evidence that we do have for each of those styles of intervention or training show, a significant impact. So I think they can all have an impact. I will say that one difference with the teacher training is that obviously it's in a whole classroom or in a small group. And so we might think that, it requires like a one-on-one interaction to be effective, but actually the teacher training studies show that it doesn't need to be. Usually the teachers themselves are randomly assigned to groups. So we'll have like one classroom is doing the theory of mind intervention and one is not. And we see a significant difference even in that larger group. I will say that most of the teacher training studies are with older children though. So there might potentially be an age effect there where like maybe the one-on-one is more effective when they're younger, but into the classroom, older kids, that seems to be just as effective. Again, I don't know if that answered your question directly, but.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Tompkins, for your talk today. And thank you all for joining us today, both in person and online. As promised, I'd like to leave a few minutes here at the end for you to fill out our short survey, which Virginia will put up on the screen. So we are aiming for 100% participation today. So we'll just give you a couple minutes to click the link or the QR code on the screen. And it's just a few quick questions.